Federalist 82, Part 3. We'll start with paragraph 4. I have in front of the camera the cover of the Penguin Classic edition of the Federalist Papers, edited by Isaac Kramnik. The text says, "The term for which the representatives are to be elected falls under a second view which may be taken of this branch. In order to decide on the propriety of this article, two questions must be considered. First, whether biennial elections will, in this case, be safe. Secondly, whether they be necessary or useful." Biennial means every other year, once every 2 years. You're going to hear the terms triennial, which means every 3 years, septennial, which means every 7 years. The most important thing in this paper you want to really focus on is the part that I told you in part 1 and the one that I just read in part 2. The fact that your religious background will not disqualify you from running for office, public service in the federal government, especially at the time. Now, state governments, state constitutions, a lot of them sometimes said you have to be Christian. Some of them said you have to be Christian and Protestant Christian, or some form of Christian religious affiliation. So don't forget that. Keep that in mind. Now, these elections the part that we're going to read about every 2 years, every 3 years, and this, he says we're going to look at the country that we have closest ties with, the closest heritage is Britain, what happened in the past in Britain, what the parliamentary elections were like, and then looks at the elections and how often the elections took place in the state of Virginia, his own state that he was familiar with. So what he says, it says we look at the 2-year term, 3-year term, 5-year term, 7-year term, and we decided that a 2-year term would be the best. And like I told you in part 1, focus a lot on the fact that back then, travel was either by horse, by stagecoach, by buggy, stuff like that. So when a representative wants to go from state of Georgia or South Carolina to one of the middle colonies, let's say if you consider Pennsylvania or southern tip of Pennsylvania, which is going to be the future capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. This is going to take this person days to get there. So Americans were so used to annual or semi-annual elections for their state legislatures that some of them were saying, wait a minute, 2 years is too long. We've got to have an election every year. And it's when the distance comes into a picture. And you have to constantly remember that at the time, there were no motorized vehicles, no internal combustion engine, no steam run ship or anything yet, at least in the United States. So because of that, 2 years is good. So focus on that. And another thing is what we just read, 25 years is the minimum age required for a person to run for the House of Representatives. You have to be 7 years citizen of the United States, and you have to be resident of the state that you're going to run for office, run for elected office. So let me read this to you then. I'm not going to give you too much detail about the rest of it. The term for which the representatives are to be elected falls under a second view which may be taken of this branch. I probably read this, but I'm going to read it again. In order to decide on the propriety of this article, two questions must be considered first. First, whether biennial elections will, in this case, be safe. Secondly, whether they be necessary or useful. First, as it is essential to liberty that government in general should have a common interest with the people, so it is particularly essential that the branch of it under consideration should have an immediate dependence on and intimate sympathy with the people. Frequent elections are unquestionably the only policy by which this dependence and sympathy can be effectually secured. But what particular degree of frequency may be absolutely necessary for the purpose does not appear to be susceptible of any precise calculation, and must depend on a variety of circumstances with which it may be connected. Let us consult experience, the guide that ought always to be followed whenever it can be found. So remember, experience. He constantly talks about we're going to rely on experience, learn from history of other countries, history of our own states. So that is one of the reasons that they put out a great constitution. The scheme of representation, now the scheme right now has a negative connotation now, but back then he says just the way we figured out this system of representation. The scheme of representation as a substitute for a meeting of the citizens in person. What does he mean by meeting of the citizens in person? Remember, at one of the earlier Federalists, we talked about direct democracies like in Athens, where all the citizens who could vote, every time there was something to be decided, they all had to gather together. He says, we've already decided that's not the method we're going to use. We're going to be a republic. We're going to have representatives represent us. So the scheme of representation as a substitute for a meeting of the citizens in person, being at most but very imperfectly known to ancient polity. It is in more modern times only that we are to expect instructive examples. And even here, in order to avoid a research too vague and diffusive, it will be proper to confine our analogy to our particular case. So we're not going to focus on ancient history. We're going to look at this past few centuries. I'm going to look at the first to which this character ought to be applied as the House of Commons in Great Britain. The history of this branch of the English Constitution anterior to the date of Magna Carta. It says Magna Charta, but it's Magna Carta. Sometimes people wrote Magna Charta, the Great Charter of the early 1200s. So whenever the British talk about the foundation of their liberty and freedom, and they go back to that date, they go back to the date that Magna Carta was written. So he says, before that, it's too obscure to yield instruction. Can't learn anything. The very existence of it has been made a question among political antiquaries. The earliest record of subsequent date prove that Parliament were to sit only every year, not that they were to be elected every year. And even these annual sessions were left so much at the discretion of the monarch that under various pretexts, very long and dangerous intermissions were often contrived by royal ambition. To remedy this grievance, it was provided by a statute in the reign of Charles II that the intermissions should not be protracted beyond a period of 3 years. on the accession of William III, when a revolution took place in the government. This is called the Glorious Revolution in 1688, 1689. So this is what he's talking about. On the occasion of William III, when a revolution took place in the government, the subject was still more seriously resumed, and it was declared to be among the fundamental rights of the people that parliaments ought to be held frequently. By another statute, which passed a few years later in the same reign, the term frequently, which had alluded to the triennial period settled in the times of Charles II. Charles II was in the middle of 1600s. He tried to mess with the how frequently, how often the parliament would be elected, but it doesn't seem like whatever he offered worked. But you don't want to go into the details right now. You can read a little bit more when you read the British history, or maybe look at like the edition of the Federalist by J.R. Pohl. He's given you some more details here. So I'll stop here, and we're out of time for this video, and I'll continue with part 4 in the next video.